Football here. Luke Jones and I will be at the game later on in the week and, of course, up late with the Orioles out on the West Coast. This guy has been up late with the Phillies out on the West Coast. I can tell from his picture out on Twitter wearing the old bubble pea hat and some sort of Grateful Dead combination that he's been at this about as long as I have. He is a professor of law. That's my next job at Villanova Law School up there in Philadelphia, where all they do is win national championships and complain to poor Jay Wright about why they don't win more. He is Mitch Nathanson. You can follow him out on Twitter. He has a book. It's not a new book. It's a year old, but it sort of came to me off of one of my pal Justin McGuire's book podcast. And Justin's a good Oriole fan, so he's struggling like all the rest of us. Some of us don't have a baseball championship in our adulthood, but Mitch got lucky enough to do that with a little Chase Utley, little Ryan Howard, a bunch of guys they probably shouldn't have signed in retrospect. Right, Mitch?
That's right.
It's always a good idea until the back end of the contract comes. We're finding that out with Chris Davis, right?
Yeah, well, you sign those contracts and you know that you're paying for today, really. I mean, you want the guy now, and you got to suck it up for those 3 or 4 years down the road. But for the Phillies, the only guy that really hurt them at the end was Howard, and even there, I mean, he gave them 3 or 4 fantastic seasons, and if it wasn't for Ryan Howard, they don't win the World Series. So I think it's a decent price to pay.
He was a jerk to my wife one time at the Super Bowl when he was a big shot, so I don't like him. But J-Roll was always cool with me. And, I was always good with Utley until I was up in the middle of the night. He's given the let's break a leg slide into second base out in L.A. I didn't think that was cool. To me, that sort of tarnishes the Utley legacy to me because I thought that was a filthy play. And I know it's accepted in baseball and all that stuff, but I thought it was kind of filthy.
Yeah, but that's Chase Utley, right? I mean, Chase Utley is that guy. Chase Utley, if you need to get a guy to break up a double play, that's Utley, and that was within the rules at the time. It's not anymore, but at the time it was, and so I guess if you don't like that play, you change the rules, and so they changed the rules. But as a Philly fan, I saw that happen, and I was like, yeah, that's Chase Utley.
Well, I mean, Philly's got a whole different thing going on, man. Dude, I've spent plenty of time up there at Broad Street. I've been hating on the Flyers my whole life, but I will tell you this, and everyone in my background knows this. In the 1983 World Series, when the Orioles were playing the Phillies, I went to every game with an Orioles shirt and a Phillies hat. I was enamored with the Phillies in my childhood, and my paternal father took me up to Philadelphia in 1981 after they had won the championship. And, the legends that were there at that point, where Morgan had been imported, Rose had been imported, Schmidt had always been there. I'd always loved watching Steve Carlton pitch, and I would only jump in the car and go up there to watch him pitch. Later on, once there was Fernando Mania and Dwight Gooden and all that stuff, as a kid who really grew up as a nerd on 33rd Street here, going to 30 or 40 games off the number 22 bus with my dad at Memorial Stadium, going to Philadelphia, man, you had the Fanatic, you had fake carpet, you didn't have baselines, you had symmetrical fields, you had National League players. I mean, guys like Garvey and Say, and when Nolan Ryan was an Astro, and J.R. Richard, they all played in Philly, and if I wanted to see them play, I would come up there. But at that time, even though the Phillies had all these legendary players, the guy that was kind of larger than life during that period where they absolutely sucked, where they're winning 50 games and Carlton's winning 25 of them, was Dick Allen. And I had Dick Allen's baseball cards back with the Chicago White Sox. It said Richard, Dick. My dad hated him. Everyone hated him. He was caught up in all sorts of, racial things, all sorts of baseball things that still exist 50 years later and apparently exist in the National Football League if you're following the Kaepernick thing. But the Dick Allen story was never fully told. But he was the thing I always knew about him was the quote about if a cow can't eat it, I don't want to play on it in regard to artificial turf. But you sort of went back a year later and took a deep dive on a guy that had some absolute monster years. And I guess for your childhood, maybe here in Baltimore, we just lost Lee May here. He was that slugger, that bopper, that was the best player on the team when you were probably 10 years old, right?
Well, when I was 10 years old, he had come back, right? So he was there in the 60s, and then he went off on his journey for about 5 or 6 years, and then he came back in the mid 70s. And when he came back in the mid 70s, I I followed that as the Phillies were trying to decide whether they wanted him back and whether he wanted to come back. And, I knew Dick Allen, but I didn't quite know what the big deal was. And so I remember when he came back that first night in Philadelphia, and there was about 8 or 9 standing ovations for this guy. And I just didn't, and I was like, he was a good player, but he wasn't Mike Schmidt. He wasn't Greg Luzinski. He certainly wasn't, a player like that anymore. And so, my whole life I was kind of, Dick Allen, whatever about Dick Allen. I didn't know much about him. And then I wrote some other book, and I just kind of had a couple of pages on Allen, and I got so much feedback about Allen, about either I had gotten it wrong or, Dick Allen is a jerk, whatever. And so that just led me to think, well, I must be missing something here. So that's why I started going back a little more deeply to see, what was going on. But I do remember when he came back in the 70s, every time he came up, it was, everybody paid attention. And it couldn't have
And he was a diminished player. Like, literally, the Phillies got a hold of him right at the end of the end. He hit 32 home runs in Chicago in 74. When he came over, the end is near for any slugger, right? We all know that, especially the guys that strike out a lot. They become Dave Kingman kind of quickly. And in modern baseball, I guess it doesn't matter if you strike out 200 times a year. But he was a diminished player when he came back, much like Eddie Murray was a diminished player, and so was Rafael Palmeiro when they came back to Baltimore.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, in '74, he led the American League in home runs, even though he didn't play the last month. I mean, he quit in early September, and he still led the league in home runs. But he came back in '75, and he was about a 220 hitter, and he didn't have a lot of power, didn't have a lot of pop anymore, and he fell off the table really fast. I mean, he's a guy who he did not have a lengthy, gradual decline. I mean, he just stopped. His productive years ended in '74, and that was it. I mean, basically, people talk about why isn't he in the Hall of Fame. You can talk about all these other reasons, whatever, and we could talk about him. But the real reason is why he's not in the Hall of Fame is because he went from being a superstar to just being finished in one season. And he doesn't have those other years where, maybe he hit 260, 265 with 25 home runs. He doesn't have those years. He has big years, and then he has about 3 or 2 and a quarter just terrible years, and then he's done.
He is wrote a book, I should say. You can go find it out on Amazon or find it on his Twitter. He is Mitch Nathanson. He is up in Villanova, The Life and Legacy of Dick Allen, and the book is called God Almighty Hisself. And give us the quote from that as to why such a grammatically poor phrase would be used by a legal and writing professor at Villanova. Dick Allen was famous for being quoted in an era where baseball players were larger than life, and sports writers would put it in the Philly Inquirer or the Daily News, right? Or even then, the Bulletin, probably, right?
Oh yeah, the Bulletin was around then. But that's not a quote that comes from Allen. That's a quote about Allen, and most people think that that's something that Allen said, but it isn't. It's actually a quote from a coach, George Myatt, he was a third base coach for the Phillies throughout the '60s, and then. Allen had trouble with his managers. He had trouble with Gene Mauch, and then Gene Mauch got fired. And then Bob Skinner was his manager, former Marine, and he quit. And so at the end of the '69 season, after Skinner quit, the Phillies promoted this guy Myatt, who was kind of a mild-mannered guy, just to kind of sail the ship into the harbor for the rest of the season, And so in a press conference announcing his promotion to manager, Myatt he would not talk about Allen. He talked about everything else, but all the media was interested in was how are you going to deal with Allen? Can you handle Richie Allen? And so finally somebody asked him, and his response was, I don't believe God Almighty Himself can handle Richie Allen, so all I could do is try. And so that's where the title of the book comes from, because Allen is a guy who. He had otherworldly powers, right? I mean, in terms of baseball. But, so there were also people who looked at him as though he thought he was God. Which I don't think that's true, but that was the perception that people had of him.
Well, he was the Phillies' Mickey Mantle during that period of time, right? I mean, everybody had a star. We had Brooks Robinson and then Frank Robinson here in Baltimore. He was the best player for that franchise for the better part of a decade, right? And it sort of all swirled around him, and they didn't have a whole lot of success during that period of time, right? 64 notwithstanding, right?
Yeah. I mean, no, he was the star. He was, and you point out Mickey Mantle, which is true. He was the star like Mickey Mantle. The problem was that he wasn't white like Mickey Mantle, and so, in baseball, there's the superstar treatment and there's the treatment everybody else gets, or at least that was true back then. But the superstar treatment was only accorded to the white superstars, a guy like Mantle or Yastrzemski. I assume Brooks Robinson. I don't really know that, but I assume Brooks Robinson. But if you were black, you didn't get that many passes from the fans or from the media. And the media in New York, they covered up for Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle would drink. He'd be drunk on the bench. And yet the media in New York would cover up for him. Whereas with Allen, every time he'd sneeze, it would show up in the bulletin the next day. And so, the thing that bothered Allen was that, the people said, oh, he wants to have a separate set of rules for himself. And that's true, he did. But the way he looked at it, was like, well, the star gets a separate set of rules. The star gets special treatment. Yastrzemski gets special treatment in Boston. Mantle gets special treatment up in New York. So I want that treatment in Philly. But he wasn't going to get it from the Philadelphia media. So that's the thing that really ticked them off. And that's the thing that caused all the problems between Allen and the media in Philadelphia.
What did you know about this going into the project, and what did you learn in regard to racism? Because let's be honest, at the heart of all of this, there was racism, and I'm sure you've read Lords of the Realm back in that era, and that Steve Carlton couldn't get along with Augie Bush out in St. Louis, and part of this thing with Philadelphia at that point is he was shuttled around. He went out to St. Louis for a year, he went out and played with the Dodgers for a year, wound up in Chicago on the South Side, where he blistered the ball along with my cousin Luis in 72 there with the White Sox and was an MVP player. But to your point, he kind of went off the ledge quickly, and I would think when he got back to Philadelphia, Michael Jack had shown up in Philly at that point. And you talk about black players and white players and different treatment. Philly fans didn't treat Mike Schmidt with any kid gloves there either. I mean, it's Philadelphia. They kind of hate everybody except the guy holding the pretzels, I think, right?
Yeah, well, it can be tough in Philly. It can be tough. That's true. That's true. Everybody kind of gets their share. Some of it is racial. Some of it is the fact that the superstar gets singled out for the criticism. And that's what people would say in response to Allen's. When Allen would complain, he didn't complain that much in terms of his treatment publicly in the white press, but he would in the black press. And the response people would say is, well, look, Philly fans booed Del Ennis before Allen showed up, so it's not racial. But it really was because he got the superstar booing like Ennis, and then like you said, like Schmidt got also. But then there was more. I mean, he was singled out in ways in which those guys never were, and I'll give you an example of that. In '64, right? So now let's talk before the collapse. Right, so everybody, maybe most people remember, or at least read about, in '64, the Phillies were running away with it, and
I don't remember it, but I feel like I remember because I've heard the story told so many times, right?
Well, right. So at the end of the season, the Phillies lost 10 straight, and they blew the pennant to St. Louis, right? So, but before they went on that tailspin, they were running away with it, and so everybody thought they were going to win the pennant, go play, probably the Yankees in the World Series. But there was a riot in North Philly in late August in '64, and it was in North Philly, right outside the stadium, in that neighborhood outside the stadium, and that the stadium at that point, or that neighborhood at that point, had become pretty much a black neighborhood. It used to be more of a mixed neighborhood, or more of a German, Irish, Polish neighborhood, and then it became a black neighborhood. And so it was an ugly riot for 3 days. The Phillies were away. The Phillies came back beginning of September, and the first thing the fans do, and there was 12,000 fans in the stands that night, is every time Dick Allen shows his face, they boo him. Now, why are they booing Dick Allen? Dick Allen had nothing to do with anything. right? I mean, first of all, the Phillies were away. Second of all, he never said anything publicly about these riots or anything. And third of all, the Phillies are in first place running away, and he's going to be Rookie of the Year. So why are they booing Dick Allen? And it wasn't just a few people booing Dick Allen.
And he was a young guy at that point, right? I mean, that was a very impressionable thing, right?
Yeah, he was 22. He was a 22-year-old kid. And, 11,000 of the 12,000 people are booing him. Now, why do you think they're booing him? So that's the difference. That's the difference between Dick Allen and the treatment that Del Ennis or Mike Schmidt got. There was that extra layer, and that's the thing that rankled him, and that's the thing that caused all the problems.
Didn't he have a fight with a teammate at one point, too? These are the things that a half a century later, you go back and do a deep dive as to how fans felt about him and how he felt about himself. I mean, the stories that I read, look, I lived through Eddie Murray here, the fan base here chased Eddie Murray out of Baltimore during his prime. And, I know what Frank Robinson went through, with water fountains and being in the National League and having to go into National League cities as a member of the Cincinnati Reds. I mean, a lot of these stories unto themselves are incredibly undignified about the history of our country, but I'm living in the present, so I'm aware of all of it, Mitch. But in the case of Dick Allen, you decided when did this become a book for you? When did this become like an interesting little project and say, well, then I'm going to do a book on this and Phillies fans are going to want to buy it?
Well, like I said, I didn't really know a lot about Allen. I mean, I knew about Allen, the baseball player, but I didn't quite know what the controversy was. And the thing that I found interesting was that, you can walk into a bar where they're talking sports, right? You can do it right now. Go walk in, whatever time it is now. But, you can walk into a bar right now where anybody's talking sports and you mention Dick Allen. Just say Dick Allen, and that's it. You're going to find the room will separate 50-50. It's going to be 50% of those people will say he was the greatest ever, and 50% will say he was the worst ever.
It's kind of like my career, I think. Yeah.
But right, that's a subject, right? I mean, you have a guy who hasn't played in 40 plus years, and you still can have an argument about this guy, and it's not even close to being resolved, right? That's the subject, right? And that's something you want to figure out. Well, why is it like that? And so there are so many things when it comes to Allen. I mean, Frank Robinson is somewhat similar. Frank Robinson had a very similar experience in the minor leagues, and he had terrible treatment in Cincinnati. And even Baltimore, he had some issues also in terms of...
Well, Hank Aaron at that time. And, look, Roberto Clemente had that because he wasn't just considered to be black. He was considered to be Caribbean and spoke another language. I mean, for the Latin players, my cousin included in the 50s, and I think it was a little different for him in Chicago. But being different was not what you wanted to be in the 1960s in Major League Baseball. Probably isn't what you want to be in the 2017s in Major League Baseball, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's always tough, and it's particularly tough in baseball because baseball is so conservative. And one of the things I thought was interesting about that era, the 60s in baseball, was that, baseball's always been somewhat conservative, but in the 60s, when you have the rest of society starting to loosen up a little bit, baseball became even more conservative. And all you got to do is go back and look at those photographs of ball players in the 60s. Look outside the stadium, there are young people that got long hair, beards, everything like that. Look at a ball player from the mid-'60s. They all got crew cuts, the clean-shaven, no facial hair. Remember throughout the 60s, nobody had facial hair in baseball. Allen and Reggie Jackson were the first guys to have facial hair, and that wasn't until the early 70s. And so baseball was reactionary. And so you're right. If you were a little bit different, and, you're a different color, you speak a different language, you're just a little bit of a different personality, you're going to get called out on all that stuff. And a lot of people just kind of sublimated it. They didn't really say much, but guys like Allen and to a large extent Frank Robinson also didn't. They kind of spoke up. And when you speak up, then it becomes a real issue.
He is Mitch Nathanson. You can follow him out on Twitter at Mitch Nathanson. He's a professor of law at Villanova Law School, along with our pal Andrew Brandt. You guys are doing the good work up there. I know you do sports writing legal writing as a sports fan. And for the Phillies, any thoughts about hope up there? You know, I put Eskin and Baldinger, all my Philadelphia buddies, come on down here, and man, it's as Dusty Rhodes would say in professional wrestling, hard times in Philly right now. Hard times all the way around, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the only thing we can do is, trust the process. The problem is that's just the Sixers. You know, it's funny that the Sixers are like the one hope we have. You know, considering what they did the last 3 years. But I don't know. The Phillies, they like to promote the fact that they think they've got a bunch of prospects. I'm not so sure. I think they got a bunch of guys who maybe can play Major League Baseball, but they're not going to be special players. And so I think the Phillies are in for a long time of mediocrity at best. I mean, I don't know. I don't see anybody in that organization who looks like they're coming up who's going to be a superstar, or even has the potential to be a superstar.
Well, next time you get together with Andy McPhail, you know, you could bring up the Adam Jones trade and thank him for that. You can also bring up collusion back in the 80s. I'm sure he could fill your little legal tablet with a whole bunch of stuff from that. But he is the resident genius, and quite frankly, I mean, he deodorized this place for Angelos Buck, and they're still eating off of Adam Jones and Chris Tillman and Chris Davis around here from those deals. He made great deals here. We haven't seen that out of Dan Duquette, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, when McPhail came to Philly, that was the idea was that, well, he's going to, I guess the idea was he was going to turn us into what the Twins were in the late 80s, but hasn't happened. It hasn't happened, and I don't see any hope of it happening in the near future. Look, I could be wrong. Wouldn't be the first time I'm wrong, but, geez, you know, I don't see anything. I see a lot of mediocrity coming up, and you know, maybe these are guys who can play at the majors, but they're not going to be standouts in the major. You know, they're just going to be guys, you know, interchangeable parts. At least I think, but I could be wrong. You know, doubt it, but I could be.
I'll tell you what, man, next time I'm coming through Villanova, I'll honk the horn on the way to the Tower Theater, the Man, or whatever I'm doing out there on the west side and en route to Conshohocken. Great to have you on. The book is God Almighty Himself, The Life and Legacy of Dick Allen, Rich Allen, Dickie Allen, whatever you call him. Don't call him the play on artificial turf. Last thing for you, the artificial turf thing is what I remember about him. You know, that would be the first thing I would say about Dick Allen. That quote, did you put a little investigation into that in the book? Because I want to hear just a little bit about the feelings of artificial turf when guys saw it for the first time and had never thought about playing on it. And he was one of them, right?
Yeah, he did say that. You know, although that quote, I did look up that quote actually, and you know that quote shows up differently in different sources. So it's hard to say exactly what he said, but he had that idea. You know, a lot of times, you know, what happened with him, and this also happened with Yogi Berra, is he would say a lot of interesting things, and then the sports writers would just kind of write their own thing. And I spoke to a bunch of sports writers, you know, who covered him in the 60s, and I was shocked to find that, first of all, nobody had tape recorders back then, obviously, but a lot of sports writers never even carried a notebook, you know? They would, like Sandy Grady, who was a legendary sports writer, he would walk in the locker room, no notebook, no pen, no nothing.
I got it all right here in my brain, right? Just like
yeah. So like one sports writer I spoke to said, yeah, he was from the French Impressionist school of sports writing. You know, he would talk to people and then he'd write his column, you know, 4 hours later, and he would quote people and everything. But you know, that's how come these quotes always come out a little bit different.
Oh, the malaprops, I'm sure, that were, attributed to Yogi Berra. Some were true and some weren't. Hey, dude, I love having you on. Appreciate it. Good luck to your Phillies up there. I don't mean that. I gave up my Phillies fandom probably when Michael Jack Schmidt was booed for the last time up there. But I did not celebrate the Phillies championship a decade ago. I've decided to sit here and suffer like a good Baltimore sports fan with the Orioles and write books about Angelos. Keep up the great work up there. We're going to send everybody up to follow you. And when I have some sports law questions, I'm going to find you and Andrew Brandt up there in Villanova, okay?
All right, well, you know, if you want to suffer, Philly's the place to be.
Or a cheesesteak or some water ice. Great having you on, Mitch. Thanks for the time, man.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
You got it. God Almighty Himself is the book about Dick Allen, the life and times of Dickie Allen. The life and legacy of Dick Allen is the official title of the book. Mitchell Nathanson. You can find that out on Amazon. You can find Mitch Nathanson out on Twitter. You can find me out on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and Snapchat and Instagram and everywhere we go, including the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault. For anything you hear here, you can download it, podcast, and listen when you want, where you want, how you want. It's how we roll around here. I am Nestor. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. If you need more information on our London events at Wembley coming up in September, toss me a note. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.